Help us reach 1,000 subscribers on our new channel Lesbian Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. I'd never imagined myself questioning everything at 33, but there I was, sitting in my office at Tulane University, staring at divorce papers while rain pelted against the window. The golden band that had adorned my finger for 8 years now sat in my desk drawer, a reminder of how spectacularly wrong I'd been about, well, everything. Professor Evans? My student assistant poked her head in. The online astronomy course registration needs your approval. Right, thanks. I barely looked up from my computer screen, scanning through the list of names. Teaching literature was my passion, but the university's new interdisciplinary initiative meant expanding horizons, or in my case, staring at stars instead of Shakespearean sonnets. That's when I saw her name, Sydney Parker. Something about it caught my attention, though I couldn't explain why. Her application essay was different, describing constellations through the lens of ancient Greek poetry. It was refreshing, almost like she'd reached through the screen and grabbed my attention. The first online class was a disaster of technical difficulties, but Sydney's voice cut through the chaos. "Professor, your microphone's muted." There was laughter in her tone, not mockery. When she finally appeared on screen, I found myself staring at piercing blue eyes and a cascade of blonde hair. 2 weeks later, she suggested a meteor shower viewing for extra credit. I agreed, not expecting anyone to show up at midnight on campus. But there she was, setting up a telescope on the humanities building rooftop. "You really came," she said, surprised. "I'm the professor. I had to." "No, you didn't," she smiled, knowing. We sat there, watching the sky paint itself with falling stars. Sydney spoke about constellations like old friends, and I found myself sharing things I hadn't told anyone, about my divorce, my uncertainties. "Sometimes the best stories aren't in books," she said softly, her shoulder brushing mine as she adjusted the telescope. "They're in the moments we least expect." The air between us changed that night. Maybe it was the way she looked at me when explaining the mythology behind Cassiopeia, or how our hands touched reaching for the telescope. Whatever it was, I felt something shift inside me, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. As dawn approached, we packed up the equipment in comfortable silence. "Thank you, Professor Evans," she said, lingering by the rooftop door. "Christina," I corrected, "at least when we're stargazing." She smiled, and for a moment, I saw something in her eyes that made my heart race. "Christina," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "I like that." Walking back to my car, I realized I hadn't thought about my ex-husband or the divorce papers all night. Instead, my mind was filled with blonde hair illuminated by starlight, intelligent blue eyes, and conversations that felt like coming home. I told myself it was nothing, just an intelligent student and engaging conversation. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. For the first time in my life, I was feeling something I couldn't explain away with literary analysis or rational thought. And that scared me more than any of the changes I'd faced this year. What scared me even more was how much I looked forward to our next class. Spring in New Orleans brought more than just blooming magnolias. It brought complications I wasn't prepared for. Every time Sydney raised her hand in class, I found myself holding my breath, anticipating her insights that always seemed to pierce right through academic pretense to the heart of the matter. After our stargazing session, something had changed. Our online discussions became charged with subtext, hidden meanings, and literary analysis that made my pulse quicken. When she compared Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets to the paths of celestial bodies, I caught myself wondering if she was really talking about us. "The gravitational pull between stars," she said during one late-night discussion. "It's like forbidden love in Victorian literature, invisible but powerful enough to alter entire orbits." I should have stopped it there, should have maintained professional distance. Instead, I found myself staying late in my office, knowing she often passed by after her evening classes. The guilt ate at me, not because of any university policies, but because of how right it felt. One evening, she knocked on my door clutching a dog-eared copy of The Price of Salt. "Have you read this?" she asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Patricia Highsmith. Not exactly on our curriculum. But you've read it?" Her eyes held mine, challenging. "Yes." My throat felt dry. "A long time ago." "When did you know?" she asked quietly. "Know what?" "That you were attracted to women?" The question hung in the air like summer lightning. I gripped my desk edge, knuckles white. I haven't. I've known since high school, she continued, saving me from my stammering. But there's something about you, Christina. Something that makes me think you're just beginning to understand yourself. Rain started pattering against the window, filling the loaded silence between us. My office suddenly felt too small, too intimate. Sydney, this conversation is inappropriate. Is it? Or are you just scared? Both, I whispered, surprising myself with my honesty. She stood up, moving around my desk with deliberate slowness. I'm scared too, but I'm more scared of pretending these feelings don't exist. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the glass like my heartbeat in my ears. Sydney reached out, her fingers barely brushing my cheek, and everything I thought I knew about myself dissolved. We can't, I managed to say, even as I leaned into her touch. Why not? You're my student. For one more month. I'm too old for you. You're making excuses. And then she kissed me, soft, tentative, giving me every chance to pull away. Instead, I found myself responding, years of suppressed desires surfacing in a single moment. The kiss deepened, tasting of coffee and possibility, until a distant door slam jolted us apart. Reality crashed back like a cold wave. I stepped back, straightening my blouse with trembling hands. This was a mistake. Was it? Her voice was steady, but I saw the hurt in her eyes. Sydney, please. Don't worry, Professor Evans, she said, formality falling like a shield between us. Your secret's safe with me, both of them. She left me there, surrounded by books and rain and the lingering warmth of her lips on mine. I touched my mouth, still feeling the ghost of the kiss, and realized with terrifying clarity that there would be no going back to who I was before. That night, I dreamed of falling stars and blonde hair and the taste of forbidden things. When I woke, I finally admitted to myself what I'd been running from, not just my attraction to Sydney, but the truth about who I really was. The question was, what was I going to do about it? Keeping secrets in academia is like trying to hide a bonfire in a library. Sooner or later, something's bound to catch. For weeks, Sydney and I perfected the dance of discretion. Professional nods in hallways, carefully worded emails, and stolen glances that lasted a heartbeat too long. Professor Evans, your presentation on modern interpretations of classical literature was fascinating, she'd say in front of others, all proper and poised. But her eyes would say something entirely different, making my skin tingle with unspoken promises. The faculty lounge buzzed with harmless gossip about my divorce, about how I seemed different lately. If they only knew. My colleague Sarah even tried setting me up with her brother. You need to get back out there, Christina, she insisted over coffee. I smiled weakly, thinking of Sydney's lips on my neck the night before. I'm taking time to find myself. The real challenge came when Sydney invited me to her family's monthly dinner. Come as my friend, she suggested, tracing patterns on my arm as we lay on my couch. My parents keep trying to set me up with their friends' sons. Having you there would help. Your friend. I raised an eyebrow. My very close friend who's helping me with my thesis. The Parker Mansion in the Garden District looked like something out of a Southern Gothic novel. Sydney's mother, Elizabeth, greeted us with practiced charm, pearls gleaming at her throat. So lovely to meet Christina, she cooed. Sydney's told us how much you've helped her academically. If she only knew how much I'd helped her daughter in my apartment last night. The thought made me blush into my wine glass. The dinner was a masterclass in subtle deception. Sydney played her part perfectly, the devoted student showing off her mentor. But under the table, her hand found mine, fingers intertwining when no one was looking. Sydney's always been different, her mother confided later, cornering me in the kitchen. So focused on academics, never interested in dating. We worry, you know. I nearly dropped my glass. I'm sure she's just waiting for the right person. That night, back at my apartment, Sydney couldn't stop laughing about it. If they only knew their perfect daughter was in love with her female professor. The word love hung between us like a shimmer in the air. She noticed my surprise and kissed me deeply, pulling me toward the bedroom. Our bodies moved together with increasing familiarity, yet each touch felt new, electric. Afterward, tangled in sheets and moonlight, she traced my collarbone with her finger. I mean it, you know, she whispered. I am in love with you. The words scared and thrilled me in equal measure. Sydney. You don't have to say it back, just don't push me away. I pulled her closer instead, breathing in the scent of her hair. I'm not going anywhere. But life has a way of testing such promises. The next morning, Sydney's phone buzzed with news that would change everything. Her grandfather had died, leaving behind a complicated inheritance and family secrets that would soon draw us into something far more dangerous than a hidden romance. They want me at the reading of the will, she said, her face pale. And they expect me to bring my close friend, who's been such a good influence. Looking at her worried expression, I realized our careful charade was about to become much more complicated. Our private world of stolen kisses and secret touches was about to collide with the harsh reality of family politics and old money. Whatever happens, I said, pulling her close, we'll face it together. She nodded against my shoulder, but we both felt the shift in the air. Our love story was about to become entangled with something bigger than ourselves, and neither of us was prepared for what would come next. The Parker family lawyer's office felt like a tomb, all dark wood and heavy silence. Sydney sat beside me, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrest. Around us, family members perched like ravens, their expressions ranging from practiced grief to barely concealed anticipation. Before we proceed, Mr. Hamilton adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. There are some irregularities in the documentation that need addressing. I wasn't supposed to be here for this private family matter, but Sydney had insisted. My close friend is also a literature professor, she'd told them. She helps me understand complex documents. A convenient excuse that no one questioned, until now. The old man's will was a masterpiece of complicated clauses and conditions. But as a professor who'd spent years analyzing texts, something caught my eye, a pattern in the language that seemed deliberately obscure. Miss Parker, Hamilton's eyes fixed on Sydney. Your grandfather's final edition includes a specific condition regarding your inheritance. Sydney's brother James snorted from across the room. Let me guess. She has to get married first? Actually, Hamilton cleared his throat. The condition states that the heir must demonstrate genuine commitment to family values through a stable, long-term relationship. My stomach dropped. Sydney's hand found mine under the table, squeezing tight. Well, that's ridiculous, Elizabeth Parker interrupted. Sydney's young, focused on her studies. How can she? I am in a relationship, Sydney announced, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hand. The room fell silent. James leaned forward, his expression suddenly sharp. Oh? With whom? I felt the weight of his gaze, saw the calculation behind his eyes. He knew. Somehow he knew. That's private, Sydney replied coolly. Private? James laughed. When there's $50 million at stake? I don't think so, little sister. As the family argued, I noticed something odd about the papers scattered across Hamilton's desk, between property deeds and bank statements. There was a document partially hidden beneath others. Something about offshore accounts and questionable transactions. James caught me looking and moved to block my view. Professor Evans seems awfully interested in our family's private matters. She's here to support me, Sydney defended. Oh, I'm sure she is. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Tell me, Professor, what exactly is your relationship with my sister? The room grew tense. Elizabeth Parker's pearls clicked anxiously as she fingered them. James, Sydney warned. No, let's hear it. He stood, towering over the desk. Because I've seen some interesting security footage from the university. Late nights in offices, rooftop meetings. Sydney paled. I felt sick. That's enough, Mr. Hamilton interjected. This meeting is about your grandfather's will, not about. It's about everything, James snapped. The money, the company, our family's reputation. And I won't let it all go to. To what? Sydney stood, trembling with anger. To your gay sister and her girlfriend? Is that what you're afraid of? The words exploded in the room like a bomb. Elizabeth Parker made a choked sound. Hamilton dropped his glasses. Sydney, I whispered. But she wasn't finished. While you're also concerned about family values, maybe we should discuss those interesting documents I noticed. The ones about missing funds and tax havens? James went very still. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Grandfather knew something was wrong. That's why he changed his will. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. I saw James's hand twitch toward the papers on the desk. saw the panic in his eyes. "This meeting is adjourned," Hamilton announced firmly. "We'll reconvene when tempers have cooled." As we left, James caught my arm. "You should be careful, Professor. Career-ending scandals can happen so easily." Sydney pulled me away, but the threat lingered in the air. Outside, in the humid New Orleans afternoon, she finally broke down. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I shouldn't have dragged you into this." I held her close, not caring who might see. "This isn't just about the inheritance anymore, is it?" She shook her head. "There's something wrong with the family business. Something James is trying to hide." We were in too deep now. The carefully constructed walls between our private and public lives had crumbled, and in the ruins lay secrets far more dangerous than our hidden romance. "Whatever happens," I told her, echoing our earlier promise, "we face it together." But as we drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were now players in a game far more treacherous than either of us had imagined. The first threat arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under my office door in a plain white envelope. Inside, a single photo, Sydney and me kissing in my car, taken through the windshield. Scrawled across it, "Resign or be exposed." My hands shook as I called Sydney. "Someone's watching us." "James," she said immediately. "It has to be him." But we couldn't prove it. Just like we couldn't prove what we'd glimpsed in those documents. Millions flowing through shell companies, suspicious transfers that reeked of money laundering. The university suddenly felt hostile. Whispers followed me down hallways. My department head, Dr. Roberts, called me into his office for a chat. "Christina," he said, leaning back in his chair, "there are rumors." "About?" "Your relationship with a certain graduate student." I maintained my poker face. "I mentor many students." "Of course." His smile was thin. "Just remember, scandals reflect poorly on the entire department." That evening, I found Sydney waiting in my apartment, surrounded by papers spread across my coffee table. "I've been doing research," she said without looking up. "The company's been losing money for years, but somehow the family wealth keeps growing. It doesn't make sense." "Sydney, we need to talk about the threats." She finally met my eyes. "I got one too, at my apartment." My blood ran cold. "What did it say?" "Back off or she loses everything." She laughed bitterly. "They know exactly how to hurt me, by hurting you." I sat beside her, pulling her close. "Maybe we should stop." "Don't you dare," she interrupted. "This isn't just about us anymore. Whatever James is involved in, it's serious." That night, we received an email from an anonymous address. Attached were bank statements showing massive transfers to offshore accounts, all authorized by James Parker. "He's stealing from the company," Sydney whispered. "That's what grandfather discovered." The next day, my faculty parking spot was vandalized, dike scratched into the pavement. Sarah, my colleague, witnessed me discovering it. "Christina," she hesitated, "is there something you want to tell me?" I was tired of hiding. "I'm in love with a woman." Her face softened. "I know. I've seen how you look at Sydney Parker. Are you going to report me?" "No." She squeezed my arm. "But others might not be so understanding." The pressure mounted. Anonymous calls. More photos. Sydney's research materials disappeared from her desk. My office was broken into, though nothing was taken, just a warning. Then came the newspaper clipping, delivered to both our doors. An article about a professor who lost everything after an inappropriate relationship was exposed. "We need to go public," Sydney decided. "Beat them to it. It'll ruin my career." "They're going to ruin it anyway." She paced my living room. "At least this way we control the narrative." Before we could decide, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Tomorrow's board meeting. Missing funds will be discussed. Be there." Sydney's face lit up. "This is it. Someone on the inside is helping us. Or setting us up." She kissed me fiercely. "There's only one way to find out." That night, as we lay in bed, neither of us could sleep. The stakes had become impossibly high. My career, her inheritance, and somewhere in the middle, our love story that refused to be silenced. "Are you scared?" she whispered in the dark. "Terrified," I admitted, "but not of being exposed anymore. I'm scared of what your brother might do to protect his secrets." She traced my face with her fingers. Whatever happens tomorrow, remember I chose you, knowing the risks. The gravity of tomorrow's confrontation hung over us like a storm cloud. We were about to step into the open, challenging both academic politics and family power. There would be no going back. Together? I asked. Together, she confirmed. Outside, New Orleans hummed with its usual nighttime symphony, oblivious to the drama unfolding within its depths. Tomorrow would change everything. We just didn't know yet whether for better or worse. The university boardroom felt like a courtroom the morning everything exploded. I sat beside Sydney, our shoulders barely touching, as James Parker strode in with the confidence of someone who thought he held all the cards. "Professor Evans," he nodded, smirking. "Surprising to see you here." Before anyone could respond, Dr. Roberts cleared his throat. "We've received some. Concerning financial documents regarding the Parker Family Foundation's university donations." James's smirk faltered slightly. "I don't see how this concerns a literature professor." "It concerns everyone," Sydney stood, pulling out a folder. "Especially when those donations are being used to launder money." The room erupted in whispers. Elizabeth Parker, sitting in the corner, clutched her pearls so hard I thought they'd snap. "Sydney," James warned, "think carefully about what you're doing." "Oh, I have." She started distributing copies of bank statements. "While you've been trying to blackmail us with photos and threats, we've been gathering evidence." I watched the blood drain from James's face as board members examined the documents. The anonymous tip had been right. This meeting was our chance. "These allegations are serious," the board chairman said. "They're nonsense," James sputtered. "And speaking of inappropriate behavior, perhaps we should discuss Professor Evans's relationship with my sister?" There it was, the card he'd been waiting to play. I stood up, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "Yes, let's discuss it." I met each board member's eyes. "I'm in love with Sydney Parker. We began our relationship after she was no longer my student, and we've done nothing to violate university policy." The silence was deafening. Dr. Roberts looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. "This is exactly what I mean," James pressed. "She's trying to distract from..." "From what?" Sydney interrupted. "From the fact that you've been stealing from the family company, that you killed our grandfather's legacy." Elizabeth finally spoke, her voice trembling. "James, what is she talking about?" "Mother, don't listen to." "The offshore accounts," Sydney continued. "The missing millions. Grandfather found out, didn't he? That's why he changed his will." James lunged for the documents, but Sarah, bless her heart, had already collected them. "I believe the board needs to review these," she said firmly. "This is absurd," James shouted. "You're going to believe a couple of..." "Choose your next words carefully," I cut in, surprising myself with my steel. "The press would love to hear about all of this." The threat hung in the air. James's face contorted with rage, but he must have seen something in the board members' expressions that told him he'd lost. "Fine," he spat. "But this isn't over." He stormed out, leaving Elizabeth Parker staring at the evidence of her son's betrayal. "Sydney," she whispered, "why didn't you tell me?" "Would you have believed me?" Sydney's voice cracked. "Over your perfect son?" The board chairman cleared his throat. "Given the severity of these allegations, we'll need to involve the proper authorities." What followed was a blur of statements and signatures. By afternoon, the police had been called, and James was being brought in for questioning. In my office later, Sydney collapsed into my arms. "I can't believe we did it." "Are you okay?" I asked, holding her tight. "No," she laughed through tears. "My family's falling apart, my mother can barely look at me, and the whole university knows about us. But somehow, I feel freer than ever." Dr. Roberts appeared in my doorway, looking uncomfortable. "Christina, the board would like to speak with you about your situation." I straightened my spine, ready to face whatever came next. Sydney squeezed my hand. "Go," she said. "I'll be here when you're done." Walking to the boardroom, I realized something had fundamentally shifted. The secrets that had threatened to destroy us had instead forced us into the light. Whatever consequences waited behind those doors, at least we'd face them honestly. The truth, as they say, had set us free. Now we just had to live with it. "I'm sorry, Professor Evans, but given the circumstances..." Dr. Roberts shuffled papers on his desk, avoiding my eyes. "The board feels it would be best if you took a position at another institution." I'd expected this, but it still stung. I understand. LSU has expressed interest. Their English department could use someone of your caliber. The careful dance around the real issue made me want to laugh. Not fired, just strongly encouraged to leave, all to avoid a discrimination lawsuit while maintaining the university's pristine reputation. When I told Sydney, she was furious. They can't do this. We didn't break any rules. We were in my apartment, packing books into boxes. The afternoon sun painted everything golden, making the moment feel surreal. Actually, I said, wrapping a coffee mug in newspaper, they're doing me a favor. Full professorship at LSU, better salary, fresh start. But it's not fair. She slumped onto my couch. You're losing everything because of me. I sat beside her, taking her hands in mine. I'm not losing anything that matters. The truth was, watching her stand up to her family had given me courage I didn't know I had. The old Christina would have been devastated by this professional setback. The new one just felt relieved. That evening, Elizabeth Parker appeared at my door, looking smaller without her usual polish. Mother? Sydney stood protectively in front of me. I came to apologize, Elizabeth said quietly. And to give you this. She handed Sydney an envelope. Inside was a letter from her grandfather, dated just before his death. He knew, Elizabeth explained, about both of you, about James, about everything. He wanted Sydney to have someone strong enough to stand up to the family when the truth came out. Sydney's hands trembled as she read. He wrote that he was proud of me. He wasn't the only one who's proud, Elizabeth said, surprising us both by pulling Sydney into a hug. Later that night, Sydney read the letter aloud as we lay in bed. Her grandfather had suspected James's illegal activities for months, but needed someone brave enough to expose them. He'd seen Sydney's strength, even when she was hiding. I'm declining the inheritance, Sydney announced suddenly. What? Why? Because I don't want anything that comes with strings attached. She rolled over to face me. I've spent my whole life trying to be what everyone else wanted. The perfect daughter, the brilliant student, the worthy heir. For once, I just want to be me. And who is that? Someone who loves literature and stars, and her former professor. She smiled. Someone who's finally brave enough to live her truth. The next day, I submitted my resignation letter. As I cleared out my office, Sarah helped pack my books. You know, she said, 10 years ago, I chose security over love. Sometimes I wonder. It's never too late to choose differently, I told her. Sydney appeared in the doorway with more boxes. Ready? I looked around my office one last time. This room had seen the beginning of our story, late-night conversations about literature that turned into something more, stolen kisses between classes, the first trembling steps toward understanding myself. You're really giving up tenure for love? Sarah asked, but she was smiling. Not giving up, I corrected. Choosing something better. That night, we sat on my apartment's balcony, sharing wine and making plans. LSU had offered me the position, and Sydney had decided to transfer her graduate studies there. What if it doesn't work out? She asked softly. What if we're crazy to blow up our lives like this? I thought about the past few months, the secrets, the threats, the fear, but also the exhilarating freedom of finally being honest. Maybe we are crazy, I admitted, but I'd rather be crazy and true to ourselves than safe and living a lie. She kissed me then, tasting of wine and possibility. Below us, New Orleans hummed with life, reminding us that endings are just beginnings in disguise. Together? She whispered against my lips. Together, I promised, and this time I wasn't afraid at all. 1 year later, I stood in my new office at LSU, arranging books on freshly installed shelves. Through the window, I could see students crossing the quad, their shadows long in the late afternoon light. Professor Evans? A knock at my door. Your 4 o'clock is here. My new teaching assistant didn't know the smile that spread across my face wasn't for the upcoming faculty meeting, but for the memories that title still stirred. Dr. Evans now, actually, I corrected gently. The promotion had come through last month, along with the publication of my latest paper, a study on hidden love in classical literature that had garnered unexpected attention. Sydney's texts lit up my phone. Dinner at 7, Mom's in town. These days, Elizabeth Parker visited often, slowly rebuilding bridges with both gentle conversation and extravagant apologies in the form of home-cooked meals. James had taken a plea deal, avoiding jail time but losing his position and reputation. The family company was recovering under new management, though the Parker name had lost some of its shine in New Orleans society. After my last meeting, I drove home to our Garden District apartment, smaller than my old place, but filled with both our books now, astronomy charts mingling with literary classics on the walls. Sydney was already there, grading papers at the kitchen counter. Her hair was shorter now, professionally styled, and she wore the confident look of someone who had finally found her place in the world. "Mom's bringing her new friend to dinner," she said, not looking up, "the one from her book club." I smiled at the unspoken implications. Elizabeth Parker had been doing some soul-searching of her own this past year. "Any news about your dissertation committee?" I asked, kissing her cheek. "They accepted my proposal, Queer Theory in Modern Astronomical Literature." She grinned. Who knew there was so much sapphic subtext in space? Speaking of space, I pulled an envelope from my bag. "Remember that meteor shower where we first?" How could I forget? "There's another one tonight. I thought maybe after dinner." She caught my meaning and smiled. "Professor Evans, are you trying to recreate our first date?" "Dr. Evans," I corrected playfully. "And maybe I am." Later that night, after a surprisingly pleasant dinner where Elizabeth had nervously introduced her friend Janet, we drove to a quiet spot outside the city. The sky stretched endless above us, stars scattered like promises. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" Sydney asked, setting up her telescope, the same one from that first night. Honestly, no. I wrapped my arms around her from behind. I was too scared to imagine anything this good. Even with everything we lost? I thought about my old position, her family fortune, the comfortable predictability of our former lives. We didn't lose anything we couldn't live without. The first meteor streaked across the sky, and Sydney gasped like she had that first night, still capable of childlike wonder despite everything. "I have something for you," she said suddenly, turning in my arms. "I've been carrying it around for weeks, waiting for the right moment." When she dropped to one knee, stars reflected in her eyes, I felt my heart stop. "Christina Evans," she began, voice trembling, "you taught me more than literature. You taught me courage and truth, and that love doesn't have to follow anyone else's rules." The ring she held caught the starlight, simple and perfect, and us. "Yes," I whispered, before she could even ask the question. Above us, meteors continued their ancient dance, witnesses to another beginning disguised as an ending. As Sydney slipped the ring onto my finger, I thought about all the stories I'd taught over the years, tales of love conquering all, of truth setting people free. I'd never really believed them until now. "Ready to go home?" Sydney asked, gathering our things. Home. Not just a place, but a feeling, a choice, a truth. "With you?" I took her hand, ring glinting between us. "Always." The city lights beckoned in the distance as we drove back, promising new chapters yet to come. Some might call our story unconventional, even scandalous, but the best stories always are. And this one? This one was just getting started.